Hello and welcome to Module 13, Nutrition for the Strength Athlete. Today we're going to be looking at the performance, recovery and body composition management considerations for powerlifters. My name is Danny Lennon and this will be a run through of all the fundamental things that you should first know about nutrition, and we will build on this in later modules where we get into specifics of making weight, weight cutting and so on. So just for some very brief context, if you are unfamiliar, to give you an idea of why I'm talking about some of this stuff, as I said, my name is Danny Lennon. My background includes a master's in nutritional sciences and an undergraduate in biology and physics, and I run a company called Sigma Nutrition where we put out evidence-based information around nutrition, as well as on the coaching side we work with a lot of powerlifters, helping them make weight and manage their body composition throughout the year and keep an eye on performance, and some of that we will talk about later on. So to start, we'll get into some of the goals of nutrition for powerlifters. And there's many different subcategories we could talk about, but there's three primary overarching things that we're going to put our focus on in this lecture today. The first of course, is how does nutrition impact performance directly? And that would include both training performance every week, as well as meet day performance, which we're going to cover a bit more detail in Module 14. Nutrition can also play a key role in recovery. So by having adequate nutrition, we can reduce the risk of illness, we can reduce the risk of injury. And not only does that save you a lot of hassle, but it also allows for better long-term progression and performance. So for example, by spending less days that you're ill or less days injured, that means you can get more quality training sessions done. You can therefore accumulate more training volume and training workload over a prolonged period of time, and therefore likely make better progress. So if we can reduce the amount of time you're doing sessions where you're either just even a small bit ill, or even if you have to completely miss a session because of illness or injury, that can make a big impact on performance as well. And then third, one of the kind of unfortunate parts, I suppose, of powerlifting is that it is a weight class based sport. So unless you are a super heavyweight, you are going to have to try and make it into a specific weight class, and therefore you need to keep an eye on your body weight throughout the year. And if we're going to maximize your competitiveness at a certain weight class, then we don't just want to look at body weight, we're looking at that body composition that makes up that given weight. And whilst we'll touch briefly on it today, we'll also get into more specifics again in the next module, where we will look at the best way to dictate, well, what is the optimal body composition for a given weight class. With this kept in mind, I'm going to start by just very briefly touching on the nutrition for recovery and how that ties into performance, because I think most of the rest of what we'll discuss today will be performance and body composition orientated. So if we consider the things that nutrition can do directly, there's kind of four initial things that we'll talk about today. One is muscle regeneration, which is just simply muscle repair and muscle growth. Glycogen resynthesis, which is just restoring carbohydrate that is used during exercise and bringing that back up to full glycogen stores, which may be important for performance. Nutrition can play a role in reducing fatigue. The most obvious extreme example of this is if you massively undereat or you completely starve yourself, you're probably going to have a lot more fatigue than if you have plenty of calories within that diet. And then also, depending on how we set up nutrition, that can have a role on immune health. So we can either have a negative or positive impact on the immune system, and this is where it ties into risk of illness, for example. So all of these things together can in some way impact recovery in the kind of broad term that we use that as. So for example, with muscle regeneration, if we have adequate protein and calorie feeding, we can maximize muscle recovery after a training session, and therefore we'll probably be in a better position for the next training session as if we'd eaten no protein. Similar things we could talk about with carbohydrates, overall calories, and then also that will play a role for reducing fatigue and the immune system like we just mentioned. If we can get better recovery session to session, then that decreases the risk of injury. So if you are going into sessions all the time where you are both underfueled and under recovered from previous training sessions, there's probably going to be an increased risk of injury because of those. And if you are under recovered, then you can probably tolerate less training volume. So particularly if you have some degree of auto-regulation built into your program, and that dictates the kind of workload that you're working with, maybe some of that is being undermined by suboptimal nutrition. That if we were to be able to fuel you better, then you would actually be able to tolerate more workload, and based on that auto-regulation that you've got going on, would have more training volume in, and then theoretically in the long run maybe making better progress. And of course, if you have a decreased injury risk, you can probably get more training volume, or even we don't need to talk about volume here per se, and that's a whole other issue with other people we'll discuss in this course, but simply think of it as your overall workload that you can manage. And if you have less reduced risk of injury and you're missing less sessions because of injuries and small niggles, then you can essentially get more work done. So one of the fundamental pieces that we should talk about is calories and macronutrients. It's probably the starting place most people end up looking at with their nutrition. And we'll run through some basic fundamentals to make sure we're on the same page before getting into some specific recommendations for powerlifters. So as a reminder, something you may have seen before, when we think about energy balance, we're looking at calories in versus calories out. Calories in is very simple. It's just the calories consumed via our food. And of course, those macronutrients we could look at would be carbohydrate, protein, and fat. And then our calories out, or our energy expenditure, is made up of a few different components. So here from top to bottom would be resting metabolic rate, our physical activity, which would include both planned physical activity like a training session, but also something called non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is movements from throughout the day adding up to a certain amount of calories. And then TEF is thermic effective feeding. So we essentially use energy when we are digesting different food components. So the important thing to keep in mind for the moment when we're talking about energy balance is kind of twofold. One is on the performance side, we're generally going to have better performance when we're at least energy balance, i.e. that calories in are roughly equal to calories going out, or we're a weight maintenance level. So there's no decrease in body weight, for example, and probably might even get some more enhanced benefit to a slight calorie surplus as well, depending on the individual, depending on their current body composition, body fat levels, and so on, which we'll discuss at a later point. But we would definitely expect that the longer someone is dieting, so in a hypocaloric or diet or a calorie deficit, the longer that goes on, there's probably going to be more of an impact on training performance day to day. It'll also probably dictate a drop in overall workload the athlete can tolerate. And the longer that athlete is dieting, particularly if they're getting very lean, that again may raise the risk for injury if they don't have a reduction in their overall workload. So there are some downsides to under eating. So for performance, we just want to eat as much as possible. However, we have to balance that out with that's probably not a good idea from a body composition standpoint. That if we massively overeat and have such a large calorie surplus that the athlete is gaining a lot of body fat, that is shifting the body composition to a place where it's probably unhelpful in most circumstances. So later we will talk about gains in body weight, particularly in the next module where we look at moving up a weight class. But for the moment, we need to know we're going to try and temper having enough calories to support performance, but also knowing at certain times we may need to change calories up or down depending on where your body composition is at and where you are relative to the weight class you wish to compete in. So if we keep that to our current model for calories right now, if we look at the macronutrients, the first one, and probably of most importance to powerlifters, is going to be protein intake. So as a run through of the kind of key fundamentals of protein intake, there's probably a few things that we can take away. First is that for an athlete just trying to maximize their amount of muscle mass and their muscle strength, and they are eating an adequate amount of calories, so let's say they're at weight maintenance or in a calorie surplus, then we want to be probably aiming for at least 1.6 grams of protein for every kilogram of your body weight. That's a kind of nice baseline figure, and going far beyond that may not have that much more beneficial impact. However, for certain individuals, they will need more than that level of protein to maximize the hypertrophic response to their training, and that would be the best protein intake for them. So we'd probably push that up to somewhere around 1.8 to maybe 2 grams of protein for every kilogram of your body weight would be a good start point. It's probably likely that for powerlifters that are in a dieting phase, that we may need to increase that protein. Couple of reasons that may be useful. One is that especially for lean athletes who are going into a dieting phase, they may be at more risk of losing some lean body mass. So we can potentially mitigate some of that with an increased protein intake. Secondly, during dieting phases, having higher amounts of protein is just generally useful. It can give a high amount of satiety and feeling of fullness, and also can limit food choices that are easy to overconsume on. But we may need to bump up protein intake during these dieting blocks. There doesn't seem to be much benefit to going beyond around 2.5 grams of protein for every kilogram of your body weight, at least for directly for performance or body composition. Now, there are some papers where they have really, really high protein intakes of around 4.4 grams per kilo, and you see that you get this increased thermic effect of feeding, potentially a bit more fat loss. But in general, we're unlikely to see any benefit beyond this type of figure. Now, the opposite question then is there any downside to going above 2.5 grams per kilo? There's probably no direct harm in terms of a health and safety standpoint of going very high protein. So let's say 3 grams per kilo or above. However, it's more a practical one. So the only case there would be a health concern would be for people with pre-existing kidney disease. So if you have a kidney disorder, then you shouldn't be on a high protein diet. For anyone else, then a high protein diet isn't going to cause any issues like that with the kidney or liver or any of these other things that have been hypothesized. It seems completely safe. However, if we do have to keep our calories at a certain level, then the higher we go above this, say 2.5 gram per kilo figure in protein, the more and more we go with increasing protein intake, we have to take away those calories from somewhere. So we're decreasing carbohydrate and or dietary fat. And both those things can actually be very useful. So we're taking those away without really getting any extra benefit. So in most cases, I would say probably around 1.8 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight for protein is probably perfect. Going a bit above that, maybe if you're in a dieting situation and already very lean, and then certainly not going too much beyond. There's no real need to go 2.5 grams per kilo or above for really any strength athlete. So now that we have that daily protein intake down, the next is to consider the per meal dose of protein to maximize that anabolic response. So in other words, if we're trying to repair muscle and build muscle at the optimal rate, we want to maximize something called muscle protein synthesis. And to do this, it seems we should probably aim for around 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per meal. And we can probably do this over a few meals across the day. And so, for example, for an 80 kilo athlete, this would correspond to about 32 grams of protein. So this is going to be, we'll show some protein sources in a moment, but this is very manageable for most athletes that have been trying to eat a high protein diet. We probably want to spread those protein feedings equally across the day. So having probably 3 to 5 high protein meals across the day where we're at least on at least 3 to 4 of those occasions hitting that 0.4 gram per kilo of protein or above mark. So again, in that case, that 80 kilo athlete, If we're trying to maximize the muscle that they're building during a certain phase, or trying to support recovery from a hard training block, then we'd probably want to have at least 3 to 4 of their meals having 32 grams or more of protein across the day, as opposed to all of their protein intake coming in one big go, let's say in the evening, and the rest of the day being pretty low in protein. Other cases where it might be useful to consume above that 2 grams per kilo figure I mentioned earlier would be injury recovery. So when an athlete gets injured, it's common to kind of forget about nutrition for a while, or go the opposite way, start trying to actively diet. Both of those things are probably not a good idea. So during cases where you're trying to recover from an injury, you probably want to keep your calories at least at maintenance level to support recovery from that injury. And then you want to have your protein intake quite high. So at least 2 grams per kilo, maybe going a bit higher, may be beneficial during a recovery window. So in terms of these numbers, what does this look like in practice? Well, if you're translating this to an athlete, or you want an idea of this yourself, there's easy ways we can look up different types of foods and say, okay, what would give me that certain amount of protein? So again, if we're talking to that 80 kilo athlete, and we might say, okay, across the day at your main 3 or 4 meals, can you have one of these foods on your plate at a specific time? Now, of course, you'll notice I've just included animal-based foods here. So if you are working with a vegan or vegetarian client, you can do the exact same thing here and just pick meal combinations that would have an adequate amount of protein. Whilst we're on that idea, here's a kind of typical list of foods that we use as high protein sources that would have both a high protein content, but also a high leucine content. So leucine is an amino acid and is probably most responsible for sparking off that muscle protein synthesis response. And so we want to have a source that has about 2.5 grams or above in a certain meal to maximize the anabolic response. Now, most animal-based sources of protein, as you can see by this list, if they have enough protein in them, then they'll typically have enough leucine, so we don't need to worry about that. Plant-based sources of protein, on the other hand, can be pretty low in leucine. So that means you might need to modify that in 2 ways if you are working with a vegan or vegetarian athlete. One would be to have an increased amount of protein. So if the protein is coming from plant-based sources, rather than aiming for that, say, 30 grams of protein in a meal, it may need to be 40 grams. The other alternative would be to supplement alongside the meal with some leucine or with some branched chain amino acids, which would contain leucine. So you can use supplemental leucine on top of a meal or at the same time as a meal to allow you to hit that certain amount of leucine, that leucine threshold, to maximize that response. And that will likely, again, maximize this muscle building or anabolic response to feeding. So beyond the protein intake, one of the big questions often comes around nutrient timing. So with nutrient timing, we can consider this in a few different ways. One would be the timing of actual meals themselves. So with regards to specifically to powerlifters, this is probably less of a concern than other types of athletic endeavors. But where it's probably going to be most useful is the pre-workout meal, and we could think of that as anywhere between, let's say, 3 to 5 hours before your training session, or just in that window of time before you go and train. Probably having a decent amount of your calories and carbohydrates for the day in that time frame. So if you train in, let's say, the early evening, this is probably pretty easy to do because your just meal in the middle of the day, you can just aim to have a decent amount of calories, decent amount of carbohydrates in that meal, and that may help your training quality. If you train first thing in the morning, this might be a bit more problematic. And again, it's not necessarily necessary to have a large meal, but if there is some way where you can bias some of those calories and carbohydrates to that period of time, you may find that there's a benefit to your training. Other people may not find that there's that much of an impact. So powerlifting certainly isn't limited per se by carbohydrate availability, and we can talk about that in a moment when we get to carbohydrates. But some people just feel better if they have a decent amount of calories going into a training session. So play around with that and see if biasing more calories pre-workout helps you. And you can also do the same thing with carbohydrate, aiming to have it in and around that workout window. With meal frequency, there's no set meal frequency that you need to stick to. So old myths like having small regular meals throughout the day is better for you because it boosts your metabolism just aren't true. So whether you prefer a regular meal frequency, so small meals just more regularly, or a low meal frequency, so bigger meals but only, let's say, 3 times a day, it doesn't really matter. You can probably fit them all in on your preference. What it becomes more an issue is practically. So there may be pragmatic benefits to changing your meal frequency depending on the phase of nutrition you're in right now. So for example, if you are in a dieting phase, it may be useful to reduce your meal frequency. If you reduce your meal frequency, now because you're on less calories overall, you can still keep your other meals fairly decently sized. And it just might be an easy way to reduce your calories by going from 5 meals down to 4, for example. The other end of the spectrum is you could have an athlete trying to gain weight and move up a weight class, and maybe they're finding it difficult just to eat enough food. So one useful strategy would just be increase their meal frequency there. So they're eating more often throughout the day. So there are more practical and pragmatic concerns here. So probably those are going to be more important than any one meal frequency being better. That being said, if we again think about muscle protein balance and trying to kind of maximize our repair and recovery after training and maximize the amount of muscle mass that an athlete has, then we probably don't want to be going and having a meal frequency of 1 meal per day. It's probably going to be beneficial to have, let's say, 3 meals plus, and having high protein in those. As we've just mentioned a moment ago, with protein intake, from a timing perspective, we're looking at a couple of things. One is this even distribution across the day. So let's say somewhere between 3 to 5 high protein feedings split across the day is probably going to be most optimal. The second thing is paying a particular attention to having some protein after training. So it doesn't have to be immediately, but let's say, and this again depends on when you ate before your training session and how long ago that was, but on average, if you have a high protein dose within an hour of finishing your training, you're probably going to be fine. But again, from a practical perspective, most people can get access to a high protein intake or a high protein meal earlier than that. So do that. If that's either a shake or a meal, doesn't really matter. Just get that in that window of time after you finish training. With carbohydrate timing, it doesn't really matter as much for body composition, really at all, I would say. And for powerlifters, probably doesn't matter that much at all either. So if we have, let's say, a different athlete who trains multiple times a day in a sport that uses up a lot of glycogen or that stored form of carbohydrate, then carbohydrate timing would really matter. We would have to make sure that in between those training sessions, we're using specific types of carbohydrates at certain times to make sure there's full glycogen stores for that next session. For the typical schedule and type of training that a powerlifter is doing, we're not really getting that close to glycogen depletion. Certainly, not in a case where you're going to be doing multiple glycogen depleting sessions per day. So in nearly all cases, this isn't really that much of a concern. More of a consideration is just your total carbohydrate intake on average. So either that's day to day or even the average across multiple days or a week. That will dictate probably most likely, do you have adequate stores of carbohydrate to do the type of training session you're doing? Because you probably, whilst it's not limited completely by glycogen, you will probably perform a lot better with carbohydrates in your system than if you have no glycogen. So that's pretty well understood. So where timing can potentially improve your performance would be, again, if you have, making sure you have some carbohydrate availability for training sessions, particularly those that are of, let's say, you may notice higher volume training sessions, and maybe even particularly some people find higher rep work, they just feel better once they have some more carbohydrates taken in before that. So play around with that, but typically having some earlier in the day may be useful, but this will again depend on what is your overall average carbohydrate intake. If you're eating plenty of carbohydrates on average most days, then you don't really need to worry about specifically how many grams of carbs you had before training or during training. It just won't matter that much. With dietary fat, again, in most cases, it just won't matter. The only consideration where it could be an issue is knowing that dietary fat will slow down your digestion time of a meal. So on meat day, for example, and we'll go through this in much more detail in the next module, but on meat day, after you've weighed in, typically if you've been someone who has cut weight and has cut carbohydrates for a few days, you'll probably want to have some fast digesting carbohydrate after weigh-in. And so at that time point, it'd probably be a bad idea to have some dietary fat because it will slow that down. Also, if before you go and lift and you're in the warm-up room and you're eating some food and you have a large meal with lots of fat in it, that will typically take a lot longer time to digest. It might feel a bit heavy, and for certain athletes, they just don't like that feeling. Others actually enjoy that, but for some athletes, just won't enjoy that feeling. So just be aware of that impact on digestion time of dietary fat. Apart from that, no major issues in terms of nutrient timing, as long as the overall amount is particularly fine, unless for some reason you're trying to rapidly restore glycogen. So beyond nutrient timing, the next thing we could think about is hydration status. Again, this typically isn't that much of an issue, I would say, for most powerlifters compared to athletes of other sports, because of, I guess, the type of training. This will more likely depend on the climate that you're in and maybe the gym that you're in as well, and depending on how much you are sweating during training sessions. So obviously some people are based in areas where it's a lot hotter than others. Some people also have a genetically higher sweat rate than others. So if you are someone who sweats a lot during training, then you might need to keep more of an eye on this than other people. The easiest way to monitor your hydration for yourself without going and get testing is simply just to keep an eye on the color of your urine. And you want to go for the kind of pale colors that you see up towards the top of this chart, and you want to stay away from any of the stronger, darker colors down towards the bottom, and just make sure you're drinking enough water overall. There's no major concern about having to take loads of electrolytes, for example, with the exception of when we're making weight, and we will talk about that in a moment. So just bear this in mind, but in general, not always, but in general, it's not that much of a concern, I would think, for most strength athletes. With supplements, this could be a whole kind of module itself, so I'm only going to really barely touch the very tip of the iceberg here for a couple of moments. A few things that are probably most athletes should consider, and then we'll move on. So if I could distill it down to a list of just a small handful of things, one just from a pragmatically useful perspective is protein supplements, and this could be either whey protein or a vegan protein or whatever protein you tolerate, some sort of protein powder that just allows you to increase your protein intake, or to allow you to have some protein after training if you don't like consuming full meals. So just as an as-needed basis. If you get all your protein from your diet, totally fine, you don't need a supplement. But just for convenience, a protein supplement can be useful. In terms of performance impacts, probably the one that is of most, I would say most used, at least in powerlifting, is our good friend caffeine, which is a kind of staple of every powerlifter's diet. In terms of performance benefits from using caffeine, you're probably looking at a dose of around 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of your body weight. And again, you're more likely to get a bigger impact towards the higher end of that. So somewhere between 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram. Again, where you are on the spectrum will be dictated by your own sensitivity to caffeine and also your own caffeine tolerance and how much you usually have. So if you drink coffee quite a lot, It will take a bit more caffeine, perhaps, for you to feel anything. Whereas if you're very sensitive to caffeine and never consume it, then having a small amount will make you immediately feel that. Now, they don't necessarily correlate with the ergogenic effect of caffeine or your effect on performance per se. But again, if you never have caffeine, you probably don't want to go into a meet day and start taking caffeine tablets and then starting feeling really jittery and anxious. So test it out and find a caffeine intake that works for you, but it's probably going to be somewhere within this range. One place where it's going to be contraindicated is probably if you train in the evenings. My bias would be to say try and rely on not using caffeine at those times, because it's just too much a risk for impacting sleep, which I think will be far better for your recovery and in turn will be far better for your long-term performance. So use caffeine if you train in the morning or midday, and then certainly use it on meet day, but probably try not to use it if you train late at night. Creatine, probably dosed around 60 milligrams per kilo. So this, again, for most people, you can just think of it around 5 grams. So somewhere between 3 to 5 grams per day. You can just use it continuously, will be of benefit. Carbohydrate supplements, probably no need to use this on any real ongoing basis. It may be useful after a weigh-in for someone who's cut weight, particularly if you compete in a federation that has 24-hour plus weigh-ins. But if you've done some degree of carbohydrate restriction to make weight, then having a carbohydrate supplement after you weigh in might be useful. And the same thing could be said for electrolytes. Both of these things we will talk about in the next module when we look at meet day nutrition. So that's as brief as I can mention on supplements. One other thing that I'll mention is if you are competing in a drug-tested federation, then of course, before you go and buy a supplement, try and make sure that it is, number one, that whatever supplement you have, the ingredients in that supplement are not on WADA's prohibited list. And also you can check the specific supplement and company that you are buying from. You can look for logos like the Informed Sport logo, which would tell you that it's independently batch tested and clear of any contamination for something that you might get popped for. So try, and particularly if you're competing at a high national or international level, then really take care when you're buying supplements and go for something that has like the Informed Sport logo or so on. So if we talk about body composition management, we will mention again more of this in the next module, but from a basic standpoint with body composition, obviously we have a weight class based sport, so we need our weight to be on point for our weight class. Second, to maximize our competitiveness at a weight class, what we actually want is to maximize how much muscle we have for that given body weight. So if we have two athletes of the same weight, so exact same body weight, but one has more muscle and therefore less body fat, they are going to have more potential to produce force with that muscle. They might not necessarily be a better powerlifter, but if all else was equal, they would. So for you as an individual, for whatever weight class you are going to plan to get into, and we will mention more on how to determine that later on, it would be probably most prudent to have, how can I maximize the amount of muscle I have for this particular weight class? And that means being relatively lean. Now, there is a point where getting leaner becomes too lean. And I'm sure you've seen this in a lot of athletes, and a lot of either you've done it yourself in the past, maybe you're currently doing it, maybe you have other powerlifters you know who make this mistake of either trying to stay too lean or diet down to a weight class below where they have to maintain it too lean of a body composition. They're unable to make the progress that they otherwise would have. It actually undermines their competitiveness in the long term, even though it seems like a good idea to them in the short term, and also sets them up for a higher risk of not being able to tolerate as much training. So with all that said, some of the basics around changing body composition. First of all, to change body weight for weigh-in, we can do that in two different ways. We can change the amount of body tissue that a powerlifter has. So changing either the amount of body fat they have or the amount of muscle mass they have will both change body tissue and therefore their weight on a scale. But we can also change their weight on the scale in other ways. And this will be what we cover in the next module, where we look at changes in body water, glycogen, which is stored carbohydrate, and gut residue. So all of these changes could be made to change body weight quite quickly. What we're talking about with body composition is the two components on the left. So changing the amount of fat mass you have and the changing amount of muscle mass you have. And so again, in general, if we can have you at a weight class where you have lots of muscle mass, that's probably going to be a good idea. So how should we set this up for a powerlifter? The way I try and like to conceptualize this is looking at this over a long period of time in different phases. So if you consider how your training program would be set up, we're all familiar with this type of model where we have a macro cycle, which could be over a year. It could be over many months, it could be over a certain competition season, but that's broken down into mesocycles or training blocks. Each of those mesocycles then has a microcycle, or most typically this is a training week, but not necessarily. And each of those microcycles then is made up of those individual training sessions. And so we work it down this way. One way to conceptualize how we can think about nutrition would be to apply this model into a dietary component. So for example, if we just change these terms to have our long-term nutrition approach, within that we break it down into distinct focused phases. Within each phase, we have a weekly structure. So what are our targets for that week? And what does the week look like in terms of calories and macronutrients and so on? And then each day, what should the athlete be doing to achieve that weekly goal? So with the weekly phases or the focused phases, for example, across a period of time, let's say your long-term approach is for a meet that's in 9 months' time, and we have many of these mesocycles building up to that. And we may have phases where you're going to be dieting to lose some body fat because you might feel it's a bit too much right now. You'll have phases where you're increasing your calories to really push more training workload. You'll have some phases where you'll have to alter that because you're coming into a meet. And then you'll have certain phases after a meet where you want to actually change your focus on nutrition and not be having to worry about it or track things in the same way. So with that, we can ask, well, how fast can we lose fat and how fast should we lose body fat? The fastest way we could lose fat mass may be counterproductive because it may increase the risk of losing muscle mass, and it also will decrease your performance in the gym. So we have to play this balancing act of where to be. Now, this will depend from person to person, and there's a million different ways we could set up the diet. But as a general rule of thumb, here's how I would probably recommend a starting point for you to think about fat loss. Probably a good point for most lifters would be to aim to lose about 1% of their body weight per week. Now, this is if they need to lose body fat. For other lifters who don't, for lifters who are good with their current body composition, for lifters who are going up a weight class, this obviously doesn't apply. If we have a lifter who would like to diet down, then aiming for about 1% of a body weight drop per week is probably a good starting point. It's probably not that aggressive that it's going to cause major issues with training. And it's also not too slow that it feels like they're dieting forever. However, there's a couple of cases where we may go faster or slower than this. We can go a bit more aggressive and lose weight faster if the athlete has a higher level of body fat right now. So the more body fat they have, then we can push that rate of fat loss a bit more without the same downsides. If there's an athlete that's already committed to a certain meet, they're at risk of missing weight if they don't drop body fat fast over the next, say, 6 weeks or so, then they may just out of necessity have to go that fast. But obviously this would be something we'd want to avoid with some careful planning. If the athlete is in a low stress training block, we can probably push fat loss a bit faster. And again, this is where the planning comes into it. If you want to have a fast rate of fat loss, then you probably will need to change your training programming and change your workload for that block of time, because you just won't be able to tolerate the same workload if you're aggressively dieting for any considerable length of time. And as I just mentioned there, you're willing to reduce that workload that you typically have. For athletes that could maybe lose weight a bit slower would be if they're already very lean and they're already close to competition and they have a high stress training workload right now. And with all these things combined, and maybe even just typically they're sensitive to low calorie dieting. So if it's some combination of these things, we may even reduce how fast we aim to lose weight because of that. Now, before we talk about calorie targets, I will mention that we typically program for calorie targets for the week with our athletes. It allows a couple of different things. It allows a change in calories from day to day, and this can be looked at in a few different ways. So here's a few examples I'll give. Let's say we have an athlete that is, again, going through a dieting period. We may have their calories go up and down like this, which is a fairly intuitive thing for most athletes, that on days they train, so let's say they train Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday in this case, we can see we're putting more calories on those days and then less calories on the rest days. So as long as the average calorie intake at the end of the week is where we want it, we don't care if it's going up and down per day. So it doesn't have to be the same each day. Another way you could do it is have a kind of refeed. So this would be something like this, where they're dieting on low calories for multiple days, but let's say on 2 days of the week, they'll have higher calorie days. So this kind of allows them to just have more food, brings more energy back in, tries to offset some of the negatives they're going to get from dieting. Another option could be if they want to go really aggressive with their calorie deficit on a small number of days, then that allows them to have more calories on others. So here we see that they keep their calories actually relatively high Monday through Friday, and this would work particularly well for an athlete who says they get all their training done on those days and let's say takes all the weekend off. And then on Saturday and Sunday where they're not training, they just don't really have that much calories at all. And so most of their deficit for the week in this case is coming from 2 days. And so this suits certain personality types who want to get all their dieting done essentially in a couple of days. So there's just different examples how we don't need to have a calorie target the exact same every day all the time. It's more looking at it as a weekly average. So when I mention on the next slide some macronutrient targets, we're kind of looking at, okay, what is the weekly average for someone's calories? And therefore they can change it day to day as long as the average for the week is the same. So if we are setting those for the athlete, with calories, it's hard to give a specific number. There's lots of different calorie calculators if you wish, but the most accurate way is to get the athlete tracking their intake, seeing how that corresponds to a change in body weight, and then changing their calories up or down based on that. So with a dieting phase, we would want the athlete to be dropping, like I said a moment ago, between 0.5% and 2% of their body weight per week, depending on how fast we want that to happen. And whatever calories is required to do that is going to be their calorie target. So we'll get them tracking, we'll drop their calories down to a projected target. If that's allowing them to lose at the rate we want, great. If not, we'll have to either decrease calories, or if their weight is dropping too fast, we'll increase calories. So all depends on their response rather than what some calorie calculator tells you. Go on the response. If it's a gaining phase, and we will look at going up a weight class, as I said in the next module, an increase of about 1 to 2% of their body weight per month is probably where we would aim for most lifters. So slight uptick in their weight from month to month, and as long as they're achieving that, we're good. If their weight isn't budging and it's not going up, we'll just increase calories more to try and achieve that. You can use whatever calorie calculation you want to get as a start point, or simply you can just get them to track, see where their calories are coming out, and increase it or decrease it by a certain amount. With protein, like I said, for most lifters, probably around 1.8 grams per kilo is probably good. To be on the safe side, we could say 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So just take your weight in kilos, multiply it by 2. For certain situations, so for example, an athlete that is injured or an athlete who is dieting quite hard for a significant period of time, we'd probably increase that protein intake up and get it closer to maybe 2.5 or somewhere around there. Fat intake, again, there's a wide range that could suit for powerlifting. It really doesn't matter that specifically. So it could be if the athlete has a preference for lower fat and higher carb intakes, we might set it around 0.7, 0.8 grams of fat per kilogram of body weight, all the way up to 1.5 grams of fat per kilogram of body weight if they prefer more fat in their diet. And therefore, we just take some of those calories away from their carbohydrate intake. And then their carbohydrates end up just being what's left over after we've accounted for protein and fat, and it's fitting in within what their calorie intake is. And we want to ensure we get a sufficient amount of fiber. So the Institute of Medicine would recommend between 25 to 38 grams, depending on if you're a female or a male. So within these parameters, how would I advise we kind of track these different metrics? If we track, there's a few different ways we can do it. I'll show you one example of a tracking sheet we have. This one doesn't have all macronutrients listed because, again, I just don't feel that for a lot of athletes, they need to be tracking very precisely the exact grams of fat or carb in their diet as long as there's enough in there. So this is one of our athletes where you can see we get them to track body weight every day, track their calories. So this could be in something like MyFitnessPal. Track protein intake, and we would have a minimum threshold we want them to be above. So you can see here that this athlete is around 83 kilos. So at 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, that's about 166 grams per day. And you can see every day their protein is above that figure, pretty much, or in and around that figure. So we have other athletes who will track all macronutrients. So they just do the exact same thing as here. They fill in their fat and carbohydrate for the day, but we're just not as worried about that. But from each day, we want their protein being above that minimum figure. I think that's important on a day-to-day basis. Carbohydrate and fat is more the average. That's kind of just not too low, and it's not impacting performance. And then calories, like I mentioned a moment ago, is more about what is their average for the week, and is that in line with what we want. So that's how one way you can track it. One question we get is about body weight measurements and is daily necessary. It's not necessary, but I think at least multiple measurements per week is more beneficial than once a week measurements. As an example of how once a week measurements can throw an athlete off, I typically show this chart where we have a 3-week dieting window for an athlete that's just a bit over 79 kilos. And we're going to compare what would happen with weekly weigh-ins versus daily weigh-ins. So on a weekly weigh-in, on Sunday, we'd weigh the athlete. They've gone down to 78.8. If we were doing daily weigh-ins, so indicated by the blue line here, we would take the average for all 7 days. So average is 78.9. So again, not real much difference there. However, if we go on to week 2, we'll do the same, either a Sunday weigh-in or weekly averages for all the days. And then this is where problems can arise if we get something like this. So here you'll see on the Sunday, there's an uptick in their body weight, which can happen for a multitude of reasons. It could be a change in their hydration. They could have had extra salt or carbohydrates the night before. They could have had a bigger meal that they had just a bit later in the evening the previous day. They could have had some extra stress or had a bad night's sleep, and that caused a bit more water retention. All these different types of things that could cause your scale weight to go up on a certain day that has nothing to do with the amount of body fat you have. And so in this case, if we were to weigh them on this final day, we see already there's a difference, a considerable difference compared to their weekly average. And so now if we were to compare their previous weigh-in, so going on weekly weigh-ins, the end of week 2 to the end of week 3, they moved from 78.0 to 77.9, so basically nothing. If we're looking at the average for week 2 versus the average of week 3, we see there's a considerable drop. So the athlete either would see that they've lost 0.1 of a kilo or 0.8 of a kilo just on the type of measurement that we're using. And so I think using multiple measures across the week and getting an average can give a more fair and accurate reflection of this, rather than just taking one day and comparing it to another random day is not really that useful. Instead, we want to look at trends over time. And particularly for female athletes that we have, we might want to compare the same point in their menstrual cycle from month to month, and those weeks being compared as opposed to one week to the next because of changes in water weight across the month. And so again, looking at trends over multiple weeks and months is more useful. So the final thing that I'll mention just for a dieting phase, just to give you some kind of practical strategies before we finish this particular module. One question that comes up around food quality, which we haven't really addressed yet, is, well, what should we do about food quality? How important does it actually matter? So if we consider this question, could someone improve their body composition on a diet comprised solely of processed and junk food? The answer to this question is actually yes, at least in the short term, right? If they were to stick to a specific number of calories and macronutrients, regardless of the foods, it is possible to be able to lose body fat. It is possible to build muscle mass, regardless of the types of foods being used. The same thing we could probably say about performance as well, that if they're eating enough calories and getting enough protein and having enough carbohydrate, then their performance in the gym will probably be just as good, at least in the short term. However, in reality, it's probably not the same thing, and particularly during a dieting phase. So for example, if you were to only eat, let's say, quote unquote, junk food during an extended diet, it makes that diet incredibly hard, because you have foods that are now very calorie dense. So you're getting a lot of calories for a very small amount of food. It's very tasty and appealing. It doesn't really fill you up that much. And so you're going to spend most of your time a lot hungrier and wanting more of that food, and you're already on low calories. So we can play around with some components of food to try and make that diet more useful. So if we do have an athlete who is trying to diet, some practical things we can modify that might make it more tolerable would be the palatability of the diet. So again, if you eat very hyper palatable, tasty, processed foods, they're very easy to overeat on. Now, we don't need to ban them from the diet, but if you're eating a lot of them and that's most of your diet, it's going to be very difficult not to overconsume and stick to your calorie targets. Second thing we can look at is satiety. So this would come back into making sure we have a high amount of protein in the diet. We'd also want to aim for a high amount of fiber in the diet. Doing both of those things can make the athlete feel fuller and not then as hungry despite being in a calorie deficit. Food volume relates to how much volume on the plate or bowl the food actually takes up. So again, we don't want real calorie dense foods. We want foods that take up a lot of volume for a relatively low amount of calories. So these are foods with a lot of water in them. So maybe something like soups or high water content fruits and vegetables, things like that can fill you up. Variation, this again is just a practical one that some athletes will find it useful to reduce the amount of variation in their meals during dieting phases. So having a few go-to meals for each of their main meals, it's just easier. It takes some of the decision making away from that, and it allows them to stick to that dieting phase a bit easier. Finally, a reduced meal frequency, as I mentioned earlier, can be useful because you're just taking out a meal that you otherwise wouldn't have had. So with all these ideas that we've talked about today, there's a few core fundamental components of nutrition. Now, one way to represent them, and I'm sure you may have seen this online before, Eric Helms has laid it out in his form of his muscle and strength pyramid, but it's essentially saying we have all these different factors that we've talked about in this module, but they're not all equal. Some matter more than others. And while this primarily goes for body composition, it also similarly just goes for performance for a lifter too. So of those, the primary importance is overall energy balance. So again, if you want to maximize performance, then having adequate amount of calories is more important than all the other little details. It doesn't matter if you're taking creatine or not. If you are eating 500 calories a day, after a while your performance is going to really suck. Similarly, if you're trying to manage your body weight, doesn't matter what else you're doing with your food, if you're eating just way too many calories and you're gaining body fat, then it doesn't matter what else you're doing. So getting that right of how much in terms of calories should I be consuming based on my goal for this phase is the most important thing. So whether you're dieting or gaining, you may need to eat more or less. If you're focused just on performance and maintaining your current body composition, then it's how much calories can I get into my diet whilst maintaining this current body composition. So staying roughly around the same weight on the most amount of calories you can. Once you have enough food ticked over, we would consider macronutrients. And as I said, for lifters, I think protein matters the most by far. So making sure you're getting enough protein day to day and also distributed across the day. Making sure you're not going too low on carbohydrate, because that will probably, for a lot of people, have a knock-on impact on performance, although not necessarily all the time for everyone. Just making sure not going too low on that, and certainly not going too low on dietary fat. So just keeping them within those fairly broad ranges that I mentioned earlier. Micronutrients, once you're consuming a decent majority of your food from, let's say, minimally processed food, or just including some fruits, vegetables, whole grains, things like that in your diet, and you're doing that with some degree of regularity and some variation, you probably don't need to worry too much about micronutrition if you're eating enough food. It may be a bit more of an issue if you're dieting or if there's certain foods you don't eat, for example, but that could be a whole other conversation that we can get into, maybe into some Q&A if you have any specific questions. Nutrient timing, as I mentioned here, once we take care of protein timing, that's the main consideration. After that, really just making sure you're having food that's overall good enough to support your training is probably going to be fine. And then supplements, there's probably a very small few that make a difference, but they relatively matter a small amount. So this representation just goes to show where you should put most of your focus. If you need to change some of these things, is starting at the bottom. If they're in place, then you can start worrying about the stuff up closer to the top. So to round off everything we've said today, remember the goal of powerlifter's nutrition is not just to make weight, it's making weight and also performing on meet day. It's recovering from training sessions day to day, and it's performing in the gym day to day as well. For performance specifically, generally we could say more calories is better than less calories. However, we want to maximize the muscle mass for a specific weight class. So your weight class may dictate that certain phases of the year you might need to diet down. Now, I suspect a lot of lifters are probably doing that too much and probably should go up a weight class and would benefit a lot from it, especially in the long term. And we can talk more of that again in the next module. But if you do need to diet down for meets, then certain periods of the year you will want to be dieting. And so in those cases, you will need to eat less calories. Be aware that extended hypocaloric dieting likely will limit your workload capacity. Not always, but it depends on how much you need to lose, what's your current body composition, and so on. But just be aware during these dieting phases, you might need to alter your total training workload, at least initially, as you are getting this dieting done. Protein intake, we said for most lifters, I would say in this range of 1.8 to 2.2, spread across 3 to 5 feedings. Again, maybe a bit higher if you are dieting or injured. Carbohydrate, doesn't matter that much. Just make sure eating an amount that for you allows you to feel the best and perform your best. And it doesn't matter too much. Same with dietary fat. Don't go too low on dietary fat. So like don't be going, I'd say, below 0.7 or 0.6 grams per kilo for extended periods. Probably just push it up a bit higher. But the exact amount, as long as your protein and calories are okay and your carbohydrate isn't so low that it's impacting your performance, probably doesn't matter a huge amount. As for food choices, just make sure, again, most of it is from the foods that you would typically think of, right? Minimally processed. And again, that's kind of not really that accurate of a term. Just making sure you're eating some fruits and vegetables, some lean meats, some dairy, some whole grains, including all those things that you probably should be. And then you can still have room for any other type of food that you want. There's really no need to ban anything. But you just probably don't want your entire diet consisting of sugar jellies and cans of Monster. With timing, maybe considering carbohydrates biased in around your workout might be useful. Similarly, I would say for calories, having a decent chunk of calories in the part of the day before you train might be useful, but again, completely depends on the athlete. And then finally, for supplementation, there's only a small number of these that you probably need to consider, and then also check the ingredients for any prohibited ones. And also, if you are a international level athlete or national level athlete and you're going to be drug tested, then it's worth investing in a supplement that comes independently batch tested. So something, for example, that would have an Informed Sport logo or other similarly independent verification on it, and that will be useful. With all that, in the next module, I believe it's module 14, we're going to talk about how you select the right weight class, nutrition strategies for moving up a weight class. So today we've just talked about dieting really. We'll talk about going up the other way in our next module. We'll talk about making weight. We'll talk about various weight cutting strategies, how to effectively employ them based on your weigh-in. And then after you've weighed in, what your meet day nutrition should look like. So that's all coming next. So hopefully this has been useful. I've been Danny Lennon. Feel free to contact me with any questions around this. And that is it for this module. Hope it's been useful.